Hey everyone, welcome to Locked On Lakers for Thursday. Brian Kamenetsky and Andy Kamenetsky. Andy, is there a drop-dead date by which the Lakers must get a Russell Westbrook deal done? That's next on Locked On Lakers.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday, sometimes on weekends, always when news breaks, no matter how you get your podcasts, where you get your podcasts, never behind a paywall, always free. Locked On Lakers is where you go for a more robust visual experience.
And Locked On Lakers on YouTube.
Yes, because that's the visual part.
Yes.
Thank you. I always forget that.
It's kind of a big deal.
It is.
Since the other thing, you can't see a damn thing.
Right. And that's what they're listening to right now, theoretically. Yeah, no, it's an important piece of information.
You've only had a year to work on it, though.
I know. I'm getting there. I thank you for filling in that gap. It's where you go to get the visual version of the podcast, and often a little bit earlier than the straight audio version. So there's some value in it there as well. Kendrick Nunn, Andy, it popped up on an interesting list on ESPN.com about returning players to watch who missed last season. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But there was an interesting story written by our friend Darius Soriano for Silver Screen and Roll that kind of touches on topics that we've been getting at in different ways throughout the summer. But it asks a really, I think, a clear question. Is there a drop dead date? Is a Russell Westbrook trade inevitable? And if so, is there a date by which it needs to happen? We retweeted the article at Cam Brothers on Twitter. Darius's position basically is they need to trade him by training camp. And that is the position of a lot of people. It's one that I haven't come around to yet, though. I think they should try, and obviously they are. Personally, though, I don't see there being a real drop-dead date here because the Lakers aren't operating in a context where you can have that kind of flexibility or freedom or whatever you want to call it. That's how I read it, at least.
I mean, I feel like there's no drop dead date when you're thinking about this from the perspective of they need to make a good deal, because there's no point to doing this just for the sake of doing it. Like if you were just going to move Russ for the sake of not having to deal with him as a player, just send him home and keep him until maybe you can possibly move him at the deadline before then, something like that. Now, whether or not the Lakers can actually do that is a separate conversation.
Right. I was going to say, and I want to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, we will. But in terms of needing to do this by, say, training camp, by, say, end of August, simply because it is untenable to have Russell Westbrook on your roster, and therefore take the best thing that you can possibly get, even if the best thing isn't necessarily that helpful for you, like in sort of the macro and the micro, and on top of it, you have to surrender assets in the process. No, I would disagree with the idea that the Lakers are in a position where they have to do that. I don't think that's smart.
Rob Pelinka turns to the media and says, I gave my all, but I guess my all wasn't good enough. It's one of those deals where they don't have. It'd be different if you were trading something. This is going to sound harsh. Something of value. Something.
First, I'll say someone of value. That'll make it sound a little less harsh.
I guess that's true. Both, but neither way, neither word really is a nice way of putting it.
No,
but like you can only do what you can do with Westbrook, and I do feel like this is one of those situations, because one of the arguments for having to get this done is they're sort of too far down the road. It is plainly obvious that the Lakers are trying to move Westbrook. Nobody's really hiding it. And
well, when your agent comes out and talks about the trade market for his now ex-client, that makes it really clear. He's not going to say this unless Thad Fauché, Russ's ex-agent, in the mother of all public statements upon their conscious uncoupling, like
very goopy.
Yes, he came out and said they're trying to trade Russ, and in trading Russ, A, they're going to have to attach assets. B, Russ is inevitably going to get bought out wherever he goes. This is all bad for my client. You don't say that unless you know, yeah, they are working very hard to move Russ.
One of the things, though, I wonder about that premise, though, Andy, is that the idea that this is something that would undo the relationship, whatever it is, between the Lakers and Westbrook. Think about Jaylen Brown. There has been some chatter since his name was really out there publicly as the big potential trade chip that Boston would throw in to try to get Kevin Durant. And Brown was on Twitter kind of with a shaking my head kind of response and all that stuff. You can make an argument that is the kind of thing where it does legitimate damage to the relationship between the star, in this case Brown, if you want to call him that, and the Celtics, because Brown, to everybody's understanding, hadn't been trying to get moved. I'm not sure that's the same with Russ. I don't accept the idea that Westbrook is against the idea of finding somewhere else to play next year.
No, according to Thad Fauché, that is what he wants to do, despite it being against his best interests.
And if that's the case, that idea that the Lakers shopping him around, going too far down that road, ruins whatever is left of the relationship, I don't think is as important. People should understand, the reason we bring this up isn't because we're concerned about Westbrook's feelings or how Russ feels about this whole thing, and are they treating him the right way or whatever. I mean, the Lakers should treat him professionally and all that other stuff, as they should everyone else. The issue is what you said at the beginning. If you put a clock on this, if you say we cannot go into training camp with this guy on our roster, every day that goes by, your ability to make a favorable trade for the organization gets smaller. You put yourself in a box where the return, which is already going to be tough, gets harder, and everyone knows it. And so I just don't think it's not smart for the Lakers to approach it in that way. The next question I want to ask you, though, is another one that came up on Twitter at Cam Brothers the other day. I was having this debate, not really a debate, but a conversation. I think Anthony Irwin was in it, maybe Jared Wade, another really good basketball voice you can find on Twitter. And we were talking about this idea of sending Russ home if he's not able to be traded by then, and whether or not the Lakers would be better off to just do that off the top, as opposed to bringing him to camp, trying to make it work, and then, if it doesn't, then you send him home. So that's another scenario that we can get into, that I think is an important one to ask. So we'll do that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by Built Bar. Built Bars, they are sweeping the nation. And as always, because they never rest on their laurels, they always exercise their creativity. There's a new flavor, cookie dough chunk puffs. It's got a light, chewy texture, real cookie dough chunks. The real stuff, not some fake.
No, they're good. They're like
BS.
Real little bumps. The bar itself, Andy, is lumpy in a good way.
Right. It's scientifically created lumps. Plus, as always, covered in 100% real chocolate. So it's all the joy of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it, and healthy for you, healthier than cookie dough. Only 160 calories, 15 grams of protein. And it's the collagen protein. It's the good stuff that your body absorbs more efficiently. There's actual health benefits for it. So order a box for you and the family, or order a box and don't tell your family about it, because really, what have they done for you lately?
Or tell them and just let them, they know what they did.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good way to keep them in line. So ditch the calories, the fat, the sugar. Get a Built bar. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCK15. Get 15% off your order. Again, promo code LOCK15. 15% off at built.com.
There's a school of thought, Andy, that the Lakers are simply a better team if Russell Westbrook doesn't play. That every minute that Westbrook spends on the floor drags them down to a place where they can't perform. Now, that is not the sort of the line that Darvin Ham, for example, has been putting out there. But it's certainly a strong line of thought, for a lot of people, who follow the Lakers, certainly a lot of Lakers fans. Where do you come down on the idea of the Lakers, if they can't trade Westbrook by the beginning of camp, just sending him home and saying, you know what, we'll pay you. You're still here, but we're gonna find it. We're gonna work for a resolution here, but we don't want you on the floor.
I don't think it's a good idea without trying it first. I mean, it's a new atmosphere. It's a coach that I think Russ, if nothing else, will respect more than he respected Frank Vogel. That doesn't mean it's going to work. It doesn't mean Russ is going to be a proverbial good listener, cooperative, malleable, whatever. I mean, these are all things that have rarely, if ever, been commonly described with Russell Westbrook.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it makes more sense to give it a go. And this, by the way, Brian, this scenario is where you might actually have a clock. Like, you give it a few weeks, assuming training camp isn't an absolute disaster, give it a few weeks into the season. And if you can see that there are problems coming from it, then you send Russ home. But then
and you pull it quick. You don't give it, there's a problem, you try to fix it. There's another problem, you try to fix it.
Again, I'm talking like you'll know a few weeks into this thing whether or not it's going to be functional and copacetic or not. But I think you owe it to the team as a whole and the goals that you're trying to achieve to use every asset and player and possibility in front of you. And for the time being, Russell Westbrook is one of those possibilities, however flawed, however skeptical you may be about it. And I get it. Brian and I were very big proponents of don't trade for this guy last year.
Oh, it was terrible. We hated it. It's a terrible idea.
But he's still on the roster, and you're still talking about a guy that, even with all the ill fit, averaged, I think it was 18, 7, and 7 last season. And yeah, they're counting stats, but at the same time, counting stats do equal production. You do need production on some level, and there is a very big gap between LeBron, AD, and whatever you consider Russ in this equation, and maybe the next couple guys after them and everyone that comes after. They do not have, I think, the talent floor to just automatically say, we will not give this a try. I think that is a short-sighted way to do it.
If the rest of the roster was better, you could get away with this. If you had more options, I think you could get away with just sending him home.
If the rest of the roster was better, Russ probably wouldn't be the same problem that he is now.
It's a good point. But like, I look at it this way, and every time I put this out on Twitter, and it happens a fair amount, where like I give my opinion on this, people say, "Oh, so it's not going to work. You're just going to." That may be true. You could do, like you say, the 3 weeks or a month, or get in November, and suddenly what was working at the beginning of October, in training camp, and as the season opened, you get a couple weeks where Russ is playing ball and things are looking good and everybody's trying their best. And you get into November or December, and it's clearly started to deteriorate. And he's not doing what Darvin Ham asks, and he's not filling in the gaps on screens and cutting hard and working off ball and being, I hesitate to say, a lockdown defender, but an aggressive defender in the way that Ham has talked about.
An attentive defender.
I'm very skeptical.
A defender who gives a rat's ass about what's actually happening on the court.
I am very skeptical as to whether or not the Ham plan is something Westbrook is even capable of executing at this point in his career. I think this skill set for him is so dull at this point. Sharpening it at age, what is he, 33, 34?
Something like that.
I honestly don't think he can do it for a sustained period of time. But they don't have another option. They don't. It very likely won't work. But if you take him away, it's not like they have 3 or 4 guys who are just going to come in and fill that space, where it's just going to operate obviously better, and you can replace that talent. And I don't think the team is good enough right now to compete for anything close to a championship. They're probably not going to get there, even if Westbrook does the things that Ham wants to, and you get the best case scenario with Westbrook. It's still probably not good enough, but they definitely don't have enough talent if they don't bother trying. And so you have to try and let it fail.
I don't see the opportunity costs also with trying it. Like I see more opportunity cost with potentially not doing it than actually trying it. Unless the Lakers, everybody reporting about this and everybody close to the team sourced all that stuff and all appearances, Thad Foucher's comment, like unless everybody is wrong and the Lakers really are newly enthusiastic about Russell Westbrook's ability to turn a page and actually become like the Russ of old while still somehow fitting in with LeBron and AD, where Russ's style
even a different version of the Russ of old who fits in and does role player things at the same time. Well, like there's a lot we're talking about here.
However you want to frame it. I'm just saying some incredible version of Russ that genuinely fits exceptionally well. However you want to frame it. Unless the Lakers are actually in that frame of mind with Russ in the future with the team, I don't see the opportunity that would, if they were really that way, it would mean they're actually passing up deals because they think Russ can be salvaged and not just salvaged, flourish. Otherwise, there's no opportunity cost. You should try what you have in front of you. And again, this requires a shorter leash and a shorter stay than what we were talking about with a self-imposed deadline for trading him. It does, though, Brian. I know we're going to get into this too. Thad Foucher, his comments about Russ inevitably getting bought out and the stigma that would come from him being, on a new team as a veterans minimum guy and all that stuff. I've been thinking about this a lot, like in terms of if Russ gets traded, he is almost certainly going to be bought out. I can only think of maybe one team where he'd go to and not get bought out in a trade. But I started really thinking about this. I'm not actually sure it is a given that Russ will actually get a job, even on a veterans minimum deal. Like it is really difficult, Brian, to start figuring out exactly where Russell Westbrook can fit. I mean, or fit in air quotes, just could make sense where a team would actually talk themselves into the idea of, hey, let's give Russell Westbrook a try. Like that there would actually be an impetus for doing this. There are few, if any, teams that I could actually come up with where you could come up with a half-assed justification for it.
It's interesting. And this to me, I mean, whether you think LeBron and Rich Paul were taking Thad Foucher to task for his letter, we're taking Russ to task for firing him for telling the truth or whatever, this gets to, he's not wrong. I mean, there's nothing in that letter that was wrong other than whether or not it should have been written and released. The actual content of it is, I think, spot on. If a more self-aware guy would look at that and this would play into the Lakers' favor, he would understand that there is nowhere for me to go. There is no good outcome for me if I am so prideful that I push myself out of this situation and think that I can still be Russell Westbrook, in quotes, on another team. And he would say, I have to do what Carmelo Anthony did or Dwight Howard did or Vince Carter did and change the way I do things, really fundamentally change the way I do things in order to prolong my career. He's not that guy, I don't think. And to be fair, Melo was out of the league before he was able to really make that transition. Dwight was basically out of the league. He was one DeMarcus Cousins injury from perhaps being unsigned by anyone. Vince Carter, to his credit, made that transition, but most guys struggle with it, especially most guys who are at that level. And I don't know. Because he's useless on a bad team. Why would you give minutes?
Okay, coming up, I've got, Brian, a few candidates.
Okay, because I was going to ask you. He's useless on a bad team. He's not helpful for a good team. He's too hard to integrate, as we've seen. So what is this list of yours, Andy Kamenetsky? Because I need to know. We'll do that next. Where is this list, Andy Kamenetsky? I need to know.
It's right in front of me, Brian. And like you said, he is absolutely useless, Russell Westbrook, on a bad team. And, a team that is truly in rebuilding mode and has young players that they're looking to foster, particularly any young guards. You don't want Russell Westbrook there at all. Most contenders are, by definition, already pretty well set, particularly at Russ's position, since we are in such a guard wing driven league, so it's such a pick and roll heavy league. Most of those teams that are in the upper echelon of the NBA, they got it covered anyway, beyond whatever questions exist about Russ. I started looking at some of the middle tier ones, Brian, like Sacramento. He and De'Aaron Fox could be the worst shooting backcourt in history. The Nets post Kyrie, if the Nets wanted him, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right, we wouldn't be having this conversation
in the first place.
Even the Kings are not dumb enough,
right,
to think that Russell Westbrook is a good idea.
Like Portland, even if you thought taking the ball out of Dame's hands at times could make life easier for him, we're going to operate more from attack positions. They just gave Anthony Simons $100 million. Josh Hart is a better two-way fit with Dame. Gary Payton II, they just paid to be a two-way fit along. So it makes no sense there. There are 4 teams, Brian.
Okay.
4 that I came up with a half-assed, somewhat plausible explanation. I want to make it clear. I'm not saying that I think any of this would actually happen. These are just 4 that I could sort of justify it in like a devil's advocate in a chaise lounge.
Those who have subscribed to the Locked On Lakers YouTube channel can see my skeptical face.
Yeah, it should be skeptical. Okay, first one, the Utah Jazz. After a Mitchell deal on top of the Rudy Gobert, they are clearly in rebuilding mode, and this could be Russ being traded for some of the role players and contracts that they don't want. The Lakers become Jazz West. I've floated this idea before.
There is some supposition, by the way, the Jazz, if they did make the Mitchell deal, would be a place that would absorb Russ in exchange for draft capital.
Right. And, you get some combination.
Also said they'd buy him out, but that's okay.
Right. Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson, etc. The Jazz, you could sort of talk yourself into this, Brian, just because they are rebuilding. But if you look at their roster, there's nobody to develop. There's actually nobody on this roster that is going to be developed at all. So unless you are really worried that Russ on this roster gives you more wins than you actually want, because if you're going for the number 1 pick, every single loss counts, and you feel like you're in better shape if your best player is Malik Beasley as opposed to Russell Westbrook, you might actually be able to get away with not just paying Russ to be on another team, maybe sell a few tickets for him being there. Because, again, there's nobody on this roster to develop, nobody there.
It's almost a stealth tank. You can look at it and say, look, we're trying to be competitive. We have Russell Westbrook. It's not going to help us win anything.
Right.
Plus, Russ has such a great relationship with the fans in Utah. So that I can picture that really developing warmly.
And then the rest of these are all buyout candidates.
Okay.
Definitively buyout, as opposed to Russ potentially getting traded to Utah or arriving there via buyout. If you really wanted to bet on the power of culture, Miami, with Kyle Lowry turning 37, maybe you feel like Russ could actually be an upgrade at times. Although, my God, him, Jimmy Butler, and Bam Adebayo on the court together, that is a lot of
Very
non-shooting.
small court. That's very 1993 NBA.
I think that's too modern. I think you got to go pre-3-point line.
Bob Cousy.
And
What did he say?
also,
Plumbers and firemen? Is that what JJ Redick said?
And those guys still shot better, provided more space. Even if you want to bet on Miami culture, Russ is about as bizarro Heat culture as any player in the league.
Yeah, I'm not buying it.
The next one that I, again, don't think it's going to happen, but I could sort of make an argument for it, would be the Mavericks. Like if they wanted somebody that they thought was more dynamic than Spencer Dinwiddie in the shot creator scorer alongside Luka role to remove some of that burden off Luka, Spencer Dinwiddie's already been paid, so doesn't have to worry about how it'll affect his money if he comes off the bench. They still have not replaced Jalen Brunson's specific talent or really any firepower beyond Christian Wood, who's a different player anyway. However, Tim McMahon of ESPN, banned McMahon. I was years ago banned with.
I was about to get to this.
Yeah. I was banned with him several years ago in Dallas. I was part of the original banned crew, but that's a story for another day. He was recently on the Hoop Collective podcast with Brian Windhorst and Tim Bontemps. And I guess Tim had heard enough about this floated as a possibility that he did a little bit of snooping around with the Mavericks, one of the teams that he knows best. And the response he got was hell no. So never say never, but and remember, Mark Cuban also recently came out on the record saying that Russell Westbrook was no longer a superstar. May not help.
Okay, so
and finally, and this one is the best, I think, legit argument you could make, or closest to it, would be him going back to the Wizards. By all appearances and accounts, Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook seemed to get along fine while they were there. There had been no reports of Russ having issues with the Wizards culturally, anything like that. They had not been, I think, actively looking to get rid of him.
Right, in part because I think they didn't think anybody would want him, but that's okay.
But, as long as
Tommy Shepard was pretty clear, we weren't shopping Russell Westbrook until he said he wanted to go to the Lakers, and the Lakers said we'd take him.
Right. And, Bradley Beal also is the guy they need to make happy. And by everything that I've heard, and, I did even a little bit of looking back, there hadn't been any appearances that he'd been unhappy. They brought in Monte Morris in the KCP trade, presumably to be their starter, but, who knows? Maybe they look for 3-guard sets or whatever. Maybe they play Russ off the bench. They tell Russ, take it or leave it. You can have a bench role. This is it. Take it or leave it. But they were the team that I was like, okay, you could make probably the strongest legit argument that it's the Wizards. So out of the entire league, Brian, I came up with one team that seemed more than halfway plausible.
And I will say the Wizards kind of fit just because that's a very wizardy thing to do. I saw a great T-shirt. I think it's one of the SB Nation blogs or something like that. Wizards blogs had a T-shirt that they issued about the Wizards that said, "We put the mid back in Mid-Atlantic," which I thought was brilliant. Like adding Russell Westbrook after a via a trade or after a buyout is like the most mid move ever. But but that gets to the point I was making. If Russell Westbrook had an ounce of self-awareness, he would look at the situation that he's in now with the Lakers and say, I have to do everything I possibly can because, it would be easier if Westbrook was a role player, was Carmelo Anthony, was a declining guy who very obviously fit into a different kind of role. But as long as he believes and demands that he needs to be Russ, that people really need to let Russ be Russ, unlike what AD and LeBron did last year, Andy.
Well, to be fair to Russ, they did not let Russ be Russ, and they missed the playoffs.
That's right. If he insists on that, he's got nowhere to go. He's too good for the kind of the crappy teams, and he's not nearly good enough or malleable enough, as you put it earlier, for the good teams. he can go play for
I'm
the
telling you,
Wizards.
man.
It's
I
it.
gave
It's
this.
the Wizards.
You can see I gave this real thought.
You did. You went through the
Yeah.
whole league. That's why I wanted. You've been telling me about this list, and I was like, I need to know which team you came up with. And I think it is absolutely like Salt Bay chef's kiss perfect that the only team you can find is the Wizards. I
Yeah.
actually think we should get together with the Locked On Wizards folks and just let them know that you scoured the league and they're it.
All right.
So we'll see. We'll see how this goes. But the Lakers can't put a deadline on trading him because they have to make a good trade. They cannot make a bad trade just to undo the Westbrook thing. They can't. That is the worst possible outcome, because if you can argue the season is punted if they can't get rid of Westbrook, it doesn't get less punted if they make a bad trade to unload Westbrook. It just means the season's still shot and now they don't have any stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Similar to how 2 wrongs don't make a right, 2 bad trades do not make a good one.
no, it'd be a shame if they did. It would be cool if they did, because this would be really easy to fix.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the worst trade ever. So that would be really easy. Just make another bad one. Locked up. We'll get to this Kendrick Nunn thing, I guess, for Friday. We'll save it for Friday. And reminder, Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you go to get the visual version of the podcast. And we'll see everybody on Friday.